So, I've just recently reread The Sovereign Individual by James Dale Davidson and William Rees-Mogg, and it's such a fascinating book that it's easy to see why it has almost a cult-like status among some circles, especially libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, and some Bitcoin enthusiasts who long for the demise of the nation-state. For example, the libertarian venture capitalist Peter Thiel wrote a glowing foreword to the latest edition. But over 25 years since it was published, how does it hold up? And indeed, is someone like Elon Musk exactly the kind of sovereign individual that the authors were thinking of? Or not? Let's take a look. Originally published in 1997, part of the long-term appeal of the book is the impression that they predicted so many things correctly, so their core analysis must be right. They talk about the rise of cyber money, Bitcoin, voice-controlled agents to do work for you, ChatGPT, virtual reality, remote working, and even remote surgery. But much of this thinking was clearly influenced by what people were already experimenting with and writing about in those early decades of the internet. Indeed, the authors make reference to the cyberpunk fiction of those times, like Neuromancer by William Gibson and the later Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. It was a time when many speculated about a future where people could escape the constraints of the physical world into a vibrant virtual reality of cyberspace that would open up new possibilities, new ways of being within a rapidly growing cyber economy. Arguably, their real twist to these ideas was to combine them with the thinking of a number of academics, such as economic historian Frederick Lane, who analysed how the organisation and control of violence has shaped societies in the past. From all of this, the core prediction of Davidson and Rees-Mogg is that the advent of the information age will subvert the political economic dynamics of violence that previously supported the successful rise of the democratic nation-state. That wealthy individuals will be able to use cryptography to protect their assets in cyberspace, hidden away from both the taxman and the criminals who wish to steal their wealth. And this will give them such a level of personal independence that they will become sovereign individuals, while the nation-state as we know it crumbles. The new sovereign individual will operate like the gods of myth in the same physical environment as the ordinary subject citizen, but in a separate realm politically, commanding vastly greater resources and beyond the reach of many forms of compulsion. The sovereign individual will redesign governments and reconfigure economies in the new millennium. The full implications of this change are all but unimaginable. And at a simple surface reading, someone like Elon Musk would already seem to be an archetypal sovereign individual, the richest man in the world, who effectively controls American access to space, controls a satellite network that has had geopolitical significance in the war in Ukraine, and who's just used his digital social media platform and immense wealth to gain an unseemly level of personal political influence. But I'll come back to take a deeper look at whether or not Musk's power really is of the kind that Davidson and Rees-Mogg were talking about. And I'll also explain why I'm not at all convinced that the logic of their own style of analysis of violence supports their conclusions about the imminent downfall of the nation-state. But to get there, I first need to lay out the core ideas of their so-called megapolitical analysis of the hidden causes of long-term changes in our societies. Like many others, the authors argue that to have credible foresight into how the information age may unfold, we need to learn lessons from the dynamics that shaped societies in the past. In particular, their analysis in this book mostly focuses on how new technologies changed what they call the economic returns to violence, starting with the agricultural revolution. Before farming started, the authors note that nomadic hunter-gatherers could use their mobility to try to avoid hostile predatory groups, as they could simply move away from any approaching threat and seek other places to gather their food. In contrast, farming required your family or tribe to make long-term commitments to stay in a particular location as you tended to and then harvested your crops. But this made it easier for marauding gangs to raid your farm, to use violence to steal from your stores of produce, as there was such a cost to you of simply moving on. And this, in turn, gave rise to the value of supporting and living near more complex settled societies, and later city-states that could offer protection. But this protection came at a cost too. The powerful were now able to organize a new form of predation, a local monopoly of violence, or government. And notice that right from the get-go, Davidson and Rees-Mogg want to colour all discussion of government as being fundamentally a protection racket, that the main purpose of government is to sell protection services by charging tax, and that this is only good value for money if they do indeed save you from an even greater cost of being raided by worse criminal gangs. And using this kind of analysis of violence, they outline the dynamics of what they think underpinned a roughly 500-year cycle between major political changes in Western civilization. They argue that as the economic returns to violence have increased or decreased over time, this has supported a greater or lesser ability for different forms of governance to exert their centralizing power over territories during each 500-year epoch. So they start by noting how the agricultural revolution eventually gave rise to the early city-states that led on to ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, as it became increasingly profitable for a centralized authority to collect taxes to support a specialized fighting force. These increasing returns to violence then in turn gave birth to the Roman Republic that grew in strength from around 500 BC to the time of Christ, the century when the territory of the then Roman Empire was at its largest extent. But over the next 500 years or so, various factors meant that the economy of the Roman Empire was not able to support the machinery of violence that had enabled it to grow in the first place. It became easier for barbarians to smash down the infrastructure of Rome than for Rome to defend or rebuild it. Compounded with increasing levels of corruption and misrule, the returns to violence were no longer enough to support the empire, and so by roughly the year 500, the Roman Empire in the West had essentially collapsed. The next 500 years, roughly, are often referred to as the Dark Ages, as so much of the knowledge of how to build and maintain an advanced civilization was lost in many parts of Western Europe. It was a reversion to a much less sophisticated way of living, but also, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, there were many areas that were freed from the regular collection of taxes. A surprising corollary to this dreary landscape was the fact that the collapse of the Roman state probably raised the living standards of small farmers for several centuries. But it was also a time where with less government, there was more anarchic, unpredictable violence against people and property. So, towards the end of this 500-year period, the Catholic Church stepped in to try to stem the chaos and provide some order and stability. The bargain that the Church struck involved acknowledgement of the overlordship of armed knights in local communities in exchange for a cessation or tempering of the violence and looting. Land titles inscribed after the surge of violence in the late 10th century suddenly bore the titles nobilis or miles as an indication of lordship. The nobility as a separate estate was created by the feudal revolution. So then, from roughly the year 1000 to 1500, it was a time where the governance and returns to violence were organized around feudalism. Peasants and particularly serfs were less free, but they lived under the protection of their feudal lord in return for taxes paid as rent in kind. This era also saw the rise in power again of city-states like Florence and Venice. But by the end of this 500-year period, the Catholic Church that underpinned this order had become decadent and corrupt, placing an ever-growing burden on the economy through the endless number of feasts and festivals and the charging of indulgences for absolution from increasingly obscure sins. The Church had changed from its earlier role of being a useful stabilizing power into now being a drag on prosperity. So, from around the 1500s or so onwards, there was an increasing number of people and territories that turned to one form or another of Protestantism in order to break free from the now stifling, centralized grip of the Catholic Church. One of the more pronounced contributions that Protestant sects made to the productivity was the scrapping of 40 feast days. This not only saved the considerable costs of staging the festivals, including outfitting the village tables with food and drink, it also freed a great deal of valuable time. And the reason Davidson and Rees-Mogg are bringing our attention to the decadence and decline of the Catholic Church during this time is to use it as a deliberate analogy to the way they see the nation-state today. The medieval church 500 years ago, like the nation-state today, consumed more of society's resources than it ever had before or ever would again. The church then, like the state today, seemed incapable of functioning and sustaining itself on even record amounts of revenue. And the Catholic Church was unable to resist the decline in their power because the changing returns to violence meant they couldn't continue to force territories to submit to their governing oversight. As their grip on society loosened, so the economic and intellectual energy released helped give rise to the Industrial Revolution, to capitalism, and indeed to the rise of the modern democratic nation-state as we know it. And together, these all increased the size and sophistication of the political economy and the tax-raising potential of a centralized nation-state. This massively increased the returns to violence available to the new nation-states compared to the older feudal system. It is easy to see why governments were more successful in extracting resources when they dealt with millions of citizens individually, rather than with a relative handful of lords, dukes, earls, bishops, contract mercenaries, free cities, and other semi-sovereign entities with whom the rulers of European states were obliged to negotiate prior to the mid-18th century. And this mattered because the industrial age had changed the nature of warfare so that the scale of economic resources you could bring to bear triumphed all else. The authors go on to argue that this is one of the reasons that Napoleon and the French nation-state had such a huge military advantage over the more feudal countries that they conquered, and that by the end of the millennium, this is also what ultimately gave the capitalist, liberal democratic nation-states an advantage over communism. But all of this historical analysis is just setting the scene for the core argument that Davidson and Rees-Mogg want to persuade the reader of, which is that as we move deeper into the information age, the new technologies enabled by computers are about to change the dynamics of violence yet again, with decreasing returns to violence. That information technology will be a radically decentralizing technology, so that we'll soon see the fall of the nation-state as we know it, and that the nation-state will be as powerless to resist the decline in their relevance as the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church were before them. With the passage of the industrial age, the megapolitical conditions that democracy satisfied are rapidly ceasing to exist. Therefore, it is doubtful that mass democracy and the welfare state will survive long in the new megapolitical conditions of the information age. And they want to portray the sovereign individuals escaping the clutches of the tax-demanding nation-state as being analogous to the Protestants escaping the endless feasts, festivals, and other demands of the Catholic Church 500 years ago. To reach their conclusions, they combine two core arguments that could be characterized as the moral superiority of extreme meritocracy and that wealth can escape into cyberspace. Let's look at each briefly in turn. As I've indicated already, Davidson and Rees-Mogg view taxation through a fairly radical libertarian framing as being a form of coercive theft by government. Capitalists generating wealth deserve to keep it, and rather than taxing excessively, governments, they say, should be competing to offer their paying customers, the wealthy taxpayers, the best services for the lowest cost. The authors also flip on its head the Marxist idea that capitalists exploit the workers, to instead talk about how striking unions lead to the exploitation of the capitalists by the workers. Until the 1990s, the typical assembly line worker at GM received only 1 day of orientation before taking his place on the assembly line. A job that you can learn in a single day is not skilled work. And they lament that time after time, unions emerged to employ violence to achieve wages considerably above market levels. They were able to do this because industrial factories tended to be expensive, conspicuous, immobile, and costly. They could scarcely be hidden. They could not be moved. Every moment they were out of service meant that their staggering costs were not being amortized. And so they think that governments and unions have worked in similar ways to use coercive force to redistribute wealth from the skilled people who actually generate the wealth to the unskilled. This has enabled unskilled workers in the West to have a much higher standard of living than true market forces would have supported. They then note that the advent of ever more sophisticated automation in the information age will push more people into the category of being relatively unskilled or even unemployable, while simultaneously increasing the wages commanded by those with the most up-to-date skills. And they were arguing this back in 1997, long before today's extraordinary advances in AI. The dynamics of automation will increase the tension between the skilled or cognitive elite, who are highly paid and highly taxed, and the unskilled, whose income is boosted by welfare support. They think this coercive redistribution will be intolerable for the highly skilled workers, and so it will not last. Now, this is not at all how I would frame these issues. I do not think that taxation is theft. Rather, it is one way to fix the market's failure to fairly reward the complex sources of society's ability to generate wealth. But I do agree that with the rise of automation and AI, we will see growing political tension between those with high skills, high agency, and high tax, and those who are less skilled or who have less agency for one reason or another. But I think there is a big flaw in the second part of their argument, where they describe how they think this tension will be resolved. The next step of Davidson and Rees-Mogg's argument is to suggest that this ever-growing tension will be resolved by the high-skilled, wealthy cognitive elite finding ways to completely avoid, or at least radically reduce taxation by the government, and to also avoid shakedowns by the unions. Unlike a steel mill, a computer program cannot easily be held hostage to the local political process. A steel mill can scarcely be moved when legislators determine to tax it or regulate its owners. A computer program can be transmitted by modem at the speed of light anywhere in the world. The owner can pack his 486 laptop computer and fly away. Like hunter-gatherers in our long-distant past, Davidson and Rees-Mogg imagined the wealthy of the future being able to pack up and move in order to avoid threats either from governments, unions, or criminal gangs. And they'll keep their financial assets growing with tax-free compound interest, cryptographically secure in virtual tax havens in cyberspace. Cyberspace is the ultimate offshore jurisdiction, an economy with no taxes, Bermuda in the sky with diamonds. And so, they argue with some glee, the most productive people on the planet will find their way to economic freedom. So these wealthy, mobile elite will have far less need to pay for protection services from the government. The authors therefore envisage a future where sovereign individuals seek out territories that are offering them the best value for money. And they think this will disaggregate governments into a set of entities that are more like companies offering a range of services to their true customers, the tax-paying wealthy elite. Then, with large numbers of wealthy taxpayers effectively renouncing their commitment to be a good tax-paying citizen of a nation-state. So the nation-state will lose its ability to raise enough revenue to keep all its financial commitments to the unskilled, the elderly, and the infirm. So, just like the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church before, the authors argue that the modern welfare state as we know it is about to collapse under the weight of unfunded obligations, and with it will go democracy too. Indeed, the idea that the course of history is determined by democratic tallies of wishes is every bit as silly as the medieval notion that it is determined by an elaborate code of manners called chivalry. There will, of course, be many who would lose out if such changes do occur, especially the millions of less skilled workers whose current standard of living, the authors say, is being artificially boosted by redistribution. So they expect a massive rise in inequality within Western countries. And although Lord Rees-Mogg and Davidson sometimes seem to enjoy portraying this new order as being a bit like a return to the more feudal times, with vibrant city-states and sovereign individuals enjoying a superior legal and power status, they also fully expect this New World Order to be accompanied by a rise in criminal gang activity, a rise in corruption, and indeed a nationalist political backlash by the net losers, a movement that they imagine would oppose globalization, would be hostile to immigration, and would involve popular hatred towards the rich, well-educated elite. Sounds like a very prescient description of our politics today. But more than 25 years after the publication of their book, I think we can see two crucial ways that their predictions turned out to be wrong. The first is that despite all the wonders of this new digital age, it has turned out that atoms have remained just as important, if not more so, than bits. Take Elon Musk. Despite all his riches, he cannot just pack away his Tesla car factory or his rocket factories and escape with all his wealth to another country. And yes, the stock market and most of the financial world may now be digital and accessible from anywhere in the world. But it all links back to physical factories or other infrastructure and real people taking actions in the physical world. And all of this physical activity, you might say the material means of production, resides within specific jurisdictions with laws that are enforced by a nation-state government that still has the local monopoly on violence. So even if you fly away to a tax haven, the nation-states that control the physical location of your wealth-generating assets can still decide to tax the income or even to tax or confiscate the assets, and you would be physically powerless to stop them. Indeed, this is exactly what recently happened to a number of Russian oligarchs who had huge assets seized from them as a result of Western sanctions on Russians with ties to Putin after his invasion of Ukraine. So what about digital goods and services being bought and sold in the cloud, or digital financial assets generating an income? Well, they may seem like they are in some kind of ephemeral cyberspace, but actually the data centers that host them are massive physical buildings that also live in a particular legal jurisdiction under the laws and physical control of a nation state. The world of bits depends on an underlying world of atoms. And so, irrespective of your political leanings, under any brutal analysis of the returns to violence today, it is very clear that nation-states still dominate the atoms and thereby have found ways to control the bits too. There are maybe some rare exceptions to this, like Bitcoin, maybe. But they are still largely a sideshow to the real economy. And in fact, governments have learned how to monitor, tax, and even at times confiscate these kinds of decentralized financial assets too. Indeed, the second major mistake in their analysis was to suggest that information technology will be a radically decentralizing technology. In fact, governments and corporations have turned the seemingly liberating nature of the internet on its head and now use our dependence on ubiquitous digital devices and services to have the most extraordinary level of surveillance and analysis of our lives and economic activities. I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but this is the brutal reality of how things have turned out. It's not even clear if the digital military technologies like drones and other asymmetric warfare tools have benefited terrorists and non-state actors more than the nation-states who can deploy these new weapons at greater scale and with greater effect because of all the supporting industrial capabilities and indeed surveillance intelligence that nations can bring to bear. So, on the core claim that underpins their whole argument that the information age will see decreasing returns to violence. I think Davidson and Rees-Mogg have simply turned out to be wrong. On balance, so far, digital technologies have had huge centralizing, winner-takes-all tendencies that have massively increased the efficient returns to violence for the large bureaucracies of government, and indeed for major corporations. So, by the logic of their own approach to analysis, the nation-state isn't going anywhere soon. And then all of their attempts to dress up their prediction as an unstoppable tide of history drop away, and we're just left with a set of fairly interesting, though not convincing, libertarian arguments by rich people who wish to pay less tax. And in light of all of this, rather than being a true sovereign individual, as envisaged by Davidson and Rees-Mogg, Elon Musk is still a citizen of America, albeit a uniquely powerful one, a troubling sort of fusion between a capitalist oligarch and a media baron. But while he may have an exceptionally high level of personal agency to act in the world as he wishes, he is not yet literally living in a different legal domain than his fellow American citizens. If he fell from political grace, which seems quite likely one day, and crossed some legal line, he could not just escape to another country with all his wealth. His fortunes and fate are intimately tied up with the American nation-state. Now, some might think I'm splitting hairs about which type of extreme individual power people like Elon Musk and indeed Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg have in this new Gilded Age. But my purpose is to highlight that it is not the nation-state that is under threat. It is liberal democracy that is under threat. And it's also important to highlight that any political libertarian arguments to shrink the nation-state are just that, political arguments. They are not backed up by some credible notion that the nation-state is suffering an inevitable decline due to a megapolitical tide of history. The cyberpunk-style future Davidson and Rees-Mogg imagined is fascinating, but things have simply not turned out that way. Yes, there is a huge amount of wealth squirreled away in tax havens, but it is not protected by some impenetrable cryptographic wizardry. It's protected by old-fashioned laws and international treaties. It's politically protected, and so this could be changed. Whether you politically like it or not, wealth-creating assets cannot escape the grip of the nation-state. And so instead, we're seeing wealth trying to take even more control of nation-states. And if the oligarchs cannot continue to convince a majority of the voting public to vote for less taxes on them, then the wealthy elite might be tempted to resort to violent tyranny if they wish to continue to hoard an excessive share of the growing wealth of our nations. And it would be a mistake to think that the critique I've presented here provides a basis to be confident that democracy will survive. The rising returns to violence that will continue to support the nation-state are already being used by brutal authoritarian regimes just as much as by liberal democracies. So if we want to keep our political freedoms and to more fairly share the growing wealth of our nations, then it's up to us to continue to make the case for why liberal democracy is the best way, and indeed the only legitimate way, to be organising the governance oversight of our political economies. And there are so many more interesting ideas in this fascinating book that I wasn't able to cover here. So, despite being slightly outdated in some sections, The Sovereign Individual is certainly worth reading, but with a critical eye, of course. But have you read the book? What important aspects do you think I skipped over or indeed got wrong? Please do continue the discussion in the comments below, and subscribe for more videos like this. Thank you for watching.